March 1942, Washington, D.C.in the dimly lit corridors of the U.S. Navy Department. Maps of the Atlantic were covered with red pins, each one marking a merchant ship lost to German U-boats. Within the first 3 months of that year, over 1.2 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk. Oil tankers burned off Cape Hatteras. Coastal convoys vanished under torpedo fire. Britain's supply lines, and with them the Allied war effort, hung by a thread. At the center of the storm stood Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and soon-to-be Chief of Naval Operations. Gruff, direct, and intolerant of inefficiency, King was known among his peers for his unbending will. President Franklin D. Roosevelt once described him as a man who shaves with a blowtorch. His subordinates whispered another nickname, the American Jellicoe. King faced an impossible equation: too few escorts, too many convoys, and a rapidly expanding ocean war. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy possessed barely enough destroyers to guard its own coasts, let alone the transatlantic lifeline. Shipyards were already stretched thin building fleet carriers, battleships, and submarines. Yet King demanded many more ships and fast. On March 5, 1942, in a meeting recorded in Navy memoranda, King issued a blunt directive to the Bureau of Ships: "We will fight with what we have and build what we don't." His solution defied naval orthodoxy. Rather than waiting for new destroyers, which took years to design and launch, he ordered that every civilian shipyard, no matter how small or inexperienced, be converted to produce emergency war vessels. Freighters, trawlers, and even ferries would be redesigned as anti-submarine escorts, cargo transports, and repair tenders. Critics in Washington and the Navy's General Board dismissed the idea as reckless. Many engineers warned that civilian yards lacked the precision required for naval construction. Skeptics sneered that the admiral was trying to build a fleet out of junk. One congressional aide called it King's scrap fleet. But King pressed on, backed by Roosevelt's wartime powers and the Maritime Commission's emergency shipbuilding program. At his insistence, the U.S. Maritime Commission approved the Liberty ship design, a simple, welded cargo vessel based on a British blueprint known as the Ocean-class. Production began in late March at converted civilian shipyards from Richmond, California, to Baltimore, Maryland. The first ships rolled off the line in record time, under 60 days. By mid-1942, hundreds of Liberty ships were already steaming into the Atlantic, carrying ammunition, food, and fuel to Britain and the Soviet Union. At the same time, King ordered the Navy to build destroyer escorts, DEs. Compact, fast, and cheaper to produce than full destroyers. These ships, powered by diesel or turboelectric engines, carried sonar, depth charges, and 3-inch guns, enough to fend off U-boats threatening Allied convoys. Within months, American industry, guided by King's uncompromising leadership, had begun turning scrap metal and steel stockpiles into warships. Shipyards that had once built fishing boats were now constructing ocean-going escorts. As spring turned to summer, the tide of destruction in the Atlantic slowly began to shift. But for now, the battle to keep supply lines open raged on, and the Admiral's crazy idea was still considered a gamble. September 1942, Richmond, California. The Kaiser shipyards roared like a city within a city. Sparks showered from thousands of torches as welders joined steel plates under the glow of floodlights. The clang of rivets echoed across the bay. Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before the war, was now overseeing one of the most ambitious industrial efforts in American history, mass-producing Liberty ships for Admiral King's fleet. Kaiser's approach was revolutionary. Instead of the traditional method of riveting hulls, his engineers used all-welded construction, a technique that dramatically reduced build time. Prefabricated sections were assembled like puzzle pieces, allowing a cargo ship to be built not in months, but in weeks. King's critics in Washington watched closely, expecting failure. They pointed to rushed production, untested welding techniques, and a workforce of inexperienced laborers, many of them women and minorities entering industrial work for the first time. But the numbers told a different story. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's yards alone had launched over 100 Liberty ships, including the SS John W. Brown, SS Jeremiah O'Brien, and SS Robert E. Peary. The latter completed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes, a feat documented by the U.S. Maritime Commission at the same time. Smaller naval shipyards from Bay City, Michigan, to Orange, Texas, were constructing destroyer escorts, DEs, at an unprecedented rate. Each DE carried radar, sonar, then called ASTIC, and advanced depth charge projectors known as hedgehogs. The first of the class, USS Everts, DE-5, was commissioned in April 1943. Every ship bore the fingerprints of King's directive. Practicality over prestige, speed over elegance. A destroyer escort was half the size of a destroyer, but it could guard convoys across the Atlantic with smaller crews and lower costs. King called them the workhorses of the sea. President Roosevelt himself toured the shipyards, praising the civilian workers as the new arsenal of democracy. In a fireside chat that December, he reminded Americans, "Our strength is not in battleships alone, but in the hands of every man and woman who turns steel into a shield." The transformation was staggering. The United States, which had ranked 14th in world shipbuilding in 1939, became the world's largest producer of warships by 1943. What had begun as King's desperate measure now stood as an industrial miracle, and yet, for the sailors of the Atlantic convoys, the test of these ships would come not in the shipyards, but in the cold, perilous waters where German U-boats still prowled in early 1943. As the Battle of the Atlantic reached its peak, the first waves of destroyer escorts and Liberty ships joined the Allied convoys sailing for Europe. What had once been dismissed as floating coffins were about to prove themselves in the most dangerous sea lanes on Earth. May 1943, North Atlantic, near convoy ONS 5. The sea was gray and restless, the sky a low ceiling of fog. Across the churning waters, a formation of merchant vessels stretched to the horizon. 50 ships strong, bound from Liverpool to Halifax. Guarding them were newly built destroyer escorts and corvettes, their radar masts slicing through the mist. Among them sailed USS Buckley, DE-51, and USS Bogue, CV-9, part of the U.S. Navy's growing hunter-killer groups formations made possible by Admiral King's shipbuilding gamble. Each group paired a small escort carrier with several destroyer escorts, creating a mobile anti-submarine force capable of hunting U-boats rather than merely defending against them. For months, King had pushed his commanders to abandon purely defensive convoy tactics. Drawing from British experiences and intelligence breakthroughs like ultra-decrypts, he advocated for aggressive, coordinated anti-submarine warfare. The key to this strategy lay in the new fleet of escort ships and aircraft, built from the very scrap his critics once mocked. That spring, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its turning point. In May 1943, Allied convoys, now covered by long-range patrol aircraft and escorted by King's new ships, inflicted catastrophic losses on Germany's U-boat arm, WWII. In that single month, 41 German submarines were destroyed, nearly a quarter of the operational force. Reports from the U.S. 10th Fleet, established by King himself in May, credited the success to the combination of radar-equipped escorts, new sonar systems, and relentless coordination between surface ships and aircraft. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, later wrote in his memoirs, "The enemy's sea and air forces had become one, a machine that left us no room to maneuver." The Liberty ships, too, played their quiet role. Thousands of them now plied the Atlantic, each carrying vital cargo. Tanks, food, ammunition, and oil. Many bore the marks of hard voyages. Patched hulls, rusted plates. But they kept moving. By mid-1943, the tonnage of ships reaching Britain outpaced the losses for the first time since the war began. To sailors aboard these vessels, the difference was visible. Convoys that had once sailed with dread now sailed with confidence, flanked by sturdy new escorts. The Hedgehog launchers on the DEs sent forward-firing patterns of depth bombs. Radar operators tracked submarine periscopes even through fog and rain. In one recorded after-action report, a British merchant captain wrote, "The Americans brought ships where before there were none. Their little escorts circled us day and night, never resting. It changed the sea. By the summer of 1943, the German Navy had begun withdrawing its U-boats from the North Atlantic. The tide, long against the Allies, had turned. Back in Washington, Admiral King remained unsentimental. In his war diary, he simply noted, "The program is working. Continue production." The scrap fleet had become the backbone of Allied naval power, and King was just getting started. With the Atlantic secured, his sights shifted to the vast, unforgiving Pacific. January 1944, Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet lay at anchor under a clear morning sky, its harbors now filled not only with battleships and carriers, but with a new generation of smaller, faster escorts and supply ships. The transformation was unmistakable. 2 years earlier, this same base had been a graveyard of twisted steel. Now, thanks in part to Admiral Ernest King's shipbuilding crusade, it was the hub of the world's largest naval force. As Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet Commandant, King had centralized naval command, something the United States had never attempted before. He personally coordinated Atlantic and Pacific operations, ensuring that production met strategy. Under his direction, Liberty ships and destroyer escorts poured through the Panama Canal in convoys, bound for the Pacific campaigns. There, they faced a different challenge. Instead of submarines, the enemy was distance, the vast expanse of ocean stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines. Every operation, from Tarawa to Saipan, required an unbroken stream of supply vessels, tankers, and repair ships. Without them, the carrier task forces that struck across the Pacific could not move or fight. King's industrial armada provided that lifeline. Converted civilian tankers became fleet oilers, keeping the fast carriers fueled at sea. Liberty ships became ammunition carriers and hospital ships. Destroyer escorts took up submarine patrols along the supply routes, protecting convoys to forward bases like Inuiatak, Guam, and Ulithi Atoll. The statistics were staggering. By mid-1944, American shipyards had delivered over 2,700 Liberty ships, 500 destroyer escorts, and hundreds of specialized auxiliary vessels. Combined, they formed the largest naval logistics network in history, a fleet that could move entire armies across oceans. King's strategic vision was recorded in a Joint Chiefs of Staff memorandum dated February 1944, in which he wrote, "We are now a global navy. The sea is not a barrier but a road, and we must control it from shore to shore." The Admiral's insistence on industrial mobilization had turned that vision into reality. Where the Imperial Japanese Navy once ruled vast stretches of the Pacific, the U.S. Navy now sailed with overwhelming presence. Liberty ships carried the equipment that built the airfields and harbors essential for the island-hopping advance toward Japan. And behind every operation, from Operation Galvanic at Tarawa to Operation Forager in the Marianas, were the unsung vessels born from King's demand to build what we don't have. In the press, journalists began calling the phenomenon King's Thousand Ships. Others, less affectionately, still viewed him as an autocrat, a man whose temper was as formidable as his fleet. Yet even his harshest critics could not deny the results. By late 1944, the U.S. Navy had become larger than all the world's other navies combined. The crazy admiral who once ordered scrap metal turned into ships had built an oceanic empire, one that would soon bring the war to Japan's doorstep. August 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The morning air was calm as the battleship USS Missouri, BB-63, lay anchored among a vast assembly of Allied vessels. Around her stretched an armada unlike any the world had ever seen, carriers, destroyers, submarines, and the humble workhorses that had carried the war from Pearl Harbor to victory. Liberty ships, oilers, repair tenders, and destroyer escorts crowded the bay, their decks lined with sailors who had witnessed the war's full arc. The center of it all, Admiral Ernest J. King, now wearing both titles of Chief of Naval Operations and Fleet Admiral, observed the moment with measured restraint. He did not attend the formal surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri. That duty fell to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, But the fleet around them was, in every sense, his creation. Just 3 years earlier, many of these ships had been blueprints on drafting tables or piles of raw steel on American docks. Now they stood as the living testament to the United States' industrial power and to King's unrelenting vision. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 6,000 naval vessels, including more than 2,700 Liberty ships, 500 destroyer escorts, and 120 escort carriers. Nearly every piece of that armada had been built in response to King's wartime directives to convert everything, use everything, waste nothing. Historians later called it the greatest shipbuilding achievement in history. What made it possible was not just the machinery of industry, but the coordination between the Navy, the Maritime Commission, and thousands of civilian workers, from welders in Portland to engineers in Mobile. They built ships faster than the enemy could destroy them, turning what had once been called scrap metal into the foundation of global victory. King's management style remained the subject of both admiration and criticism. He was known for terse memoranda, late-night directives, and his refusal to tolerate compromise. Yet his clarity of purpose had given the United States Navy something it had never possessed before. Scaled in his post-war report to the Secretary of the Navy, dated December 1945, King wrote, "Superiority at sea was not achieved by the strength of a few ships, but by the total power of a fleet that could be replaced faster than it could be struck." He retired in 1946, leaving behind a Navy that dwarfed its pre-war self and had no equal in modern history. The Liberty ships continued to sail for decades after the war, carrying civilian cargo and humanitarian supplies across the world. The destroyer escorts, too, found new life, reclassified as frigates and patrol ships during the Cold War, their lineage a lasting reminder of wartime innovation born under pressure. When later asked about the criticism he faced for his aggressive shipbuilding policies, King's biographers often cited his characteristic reply, "I didn't care what they called it, as long as it floated, fought, and finished the job." And so it did. The fleet that began as a desperate improvisation had become the decisive instrument of victory, proving that vision, when paired with industrial will, can turn scrap metal into history.